On December 20th, 1943, a B-17 Flying Fortress, famously christened Lucky Strike, struggled across the expanse of the English Channel, a harrowing sight akin to a gravely injured beast defiantly clinging to life. Its No. 3 engine was utterly obliterated, not merely rendered inoperative, but violently ripped from its mountings by devastating flak encountered over Bremen, leaving behind a gaping, ragged void in the wing structure. Vivid crimson streaks of hydraulic fluid marred the fuselage, a stark testament to its internal wounds. The ball turret hung at an alarming, precarious angle, its gunner having tragically perished earlier in the mission. By every established protocol, every meticulously drafted regulation, and indeed, every complex physics calculation published by the Army Air Forces, this severely crippled bomber should have plunged irrevocably into the frigid depths of the North Sea a full 20 minutes prior. Yet, against all odds, it persevered. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the aircraft's determined pilot, wrestled this mangled warbird through the skies, sustained by an arduous combination of sheer physical exertion, fervent supplication, and an elusive, unquantifiable factor. This mysterious element was attributed to an undocumented intervention by the ground crew, a clandestine modification performed on his aircraft 3 weeks earlier, entirely absent from any official manual. When the Lucky Strike finally made its dramatic, albeit perilous, rendezvous with the runway at RAF Bassingbourn, it did so precariously balanced on a single landing gear leg. The opposing leg steadfastly refused to deploy, a direct consequence of the complete absence of hydraulic pressure necessary for its operation. Webb masterfully skidded the colossal fortress down the tarmac, generating a spectacular torrent of sparks that vividly illuminated the night sky, visible even from the distant control tower a mile away. Rescue personnel, braced for the grim task of extracting fatalities, were instead met with the astonishing sight of 8 crew members emerging under their own power, profoundly shaken, but miraculously alive. The 9th, the unfortunate ball turret gunner, had been lost during the engagement over the target area, but the rest of the crew had defied the impossible, returning home aboard an aircraft that, according to subsequent post-flight analyses, had suffered a complete failure of primary hydraulic function, experienced catastrophic damage to its fuel system, and endured electrical malfunctions that should have rendered controlled flight utterly unachievable. Group Commander Colonel James Albertson surveyed the mangled remnants of the bomber on the tarmac, his mind grappling with the singular, paramount inquiry. How? The official, bureaucratic explanation would necessitate months of meticulous investigation. However, the true, unspoken answer was already diligently at work in a hangar situated a mere 200 yards away, a solitary figure with arms plunged elbow-deep into the engine cowling of another B-17, implementing unauthorized modifications that, if ever formally documented, would undoubtedly have resulted in a court-martial. Indeed, the Army Air Forces in the waning months of 1943 confronted a pervasive issue that proved stubbornly difficult to articulate within the confines of formal after-action reports. Bombers were being lost, a grim reality of warfare over Nazi Germany, where the formidable Luftwaffe certainly did not dispense participation trophies. However, a disquieting trend emerged. Aircraft were succumbing to damage that, by conventional understanding, ought not to have been fatal. A solitary strike from enemy flak, landing in a seemingly inconsequential location, could cause a B-17, an aircraft ostensibly capable of absorbing punishment that would utterly shred 3 fighter planes, to inexplicably plummet from formation. A fundamental flaw inherent in the aircraft's design was suspected, yet Boeing, the manufacturer, displayed no inclination to acknowledge such deficiencies. The Pentagon, for its part, evinced little interest in investigating these claims, and tragically, aircrews continued to perish as a direct consequence of this unaddressed problem. Therefore, the extraordinary survival of the Lucky Strike was not merely a stroke of good fortune. It served as irrefutable evidence that an individual had successfully identified this critical design vulnerability and devised an ingenious, albeit unorthodox, remedy. These methods were so unconventional that they would undoubtedly have provoked apoplectic shock among procurement officers. This narrative chronicles the remarkable saga of how one dedicated mechanic's unauthorized and forbidden modifications transformed the B-17 from what was, on certain missions, a statistical death sentence, into the legendary, resilient survivor it is revered as today. This transformative journey began with a man whose practical mechanical acumen was honed not within the structured environment of a technical school, but rather in a gritty, Depression-era garage in Pittsburgh, where the prevailing ethos was starkly pragmatic. If it didn't work, it simply didn't get fixed. Staff Sergeant Paul Zuck, by the letter of his official orders, was not designated for the intricate task of repairing airplanes. His Army Air Force personnel file indicated that his impressive scores on mechanical aptitude tests warranted an assignment to the motor pool, a domain of trucks, jeeps, and the generally unglamorous, utilitarian machinery essential for the operational continuity of an air base. However, a perceptive individual within the assignment office at Bassingbourn, after reviewing Zuck's civilian employment history, initiated a lateral transfer that, in retrospect, likely spared countless lives. Prior to the outbreak of war, Zuck had operated a bustling repair shop nestled within Pittsburgh's Polish Hill neighborhood. There, he had diligently maintained a diverse fleet of vehicles, including rugged coal trucks, reliable delivery vans, and even the occasional souped-up Ford belonging to a local bootlegger, all while operating under financial constraints so severe they would make a poverty-line budget appear lavish. He arrived at Bassingbourn in August 1943, a pragmatic 26-year-old, with the indelible mark of grease perpetually beneath his fingernails and a distinctly unconventional attitude towards military regulations that his commanding officers would, with alternating frustration and gratitude, find both infuriating and invaluable. During his inaugural week on the flight line, Zuck observed a crew chief decisively reject a B-17 due to a cracked hydraulic line. This action was entirely consistent with standard operating procedure, meticulously adhering to Technical Order 012 EG2. However, the requisite replacement part was on backorder, condemning the aircraft to remain grounded. Consequently, the scheduled mission commenced with one fewer bomber. Zuck, ever the pragmatist, inquired why they couldn't simply bypass the compromised section and reroute the hydraulic flow through a secondary line. The crew chief regarded him with an expression of utter incredulity, as if Zuck had proposed mending the wings with baling wire. "That's not in the manual, Sergeant," he retorted. Zuck's legendary reply, delivered with a Pittsburgh accent so pronounced one could metaphorically cut it with a wrench, quickly became a cherished anecdote within the maintenance section. "The manual didn't grow up fixing trucks during the Depression. I did." This fundamental distinction illuminated what truly set Zuck apart from the myriad of mechanics who had acquired their expertise within the structured environment of Army technical schools. These formally trained individuals excelled at meticulously following technical orders, executing repairs precisely as specified by Boeing engineers, and maintaining B-17s to stringent factory specifications. Zuck, however, possessed the unique ability to examine a failing system and pose a crucial question that the original engineers had apparently overlooked. What catastrophic consequences ensue when this critical component fails over Germany, where no parts depot exists at an altitude of 20,000 feet? His particular genius resided not in his comprehension of how mechanisms were designed to function flawlessly, but rather in his profound understanding of how they could still be made operational even when everything else had gone disastrously wrong. By October, a growing awareness began to circulate among the other mechanics. Aircraft that had undergone Zuck's attention displayed an uncanny propensity for returning from missions that, by all logical assessment, they should never have survived. One specific bomber he had serviced sustained a direct flak hit through its hydraulic bay. Such damage should have resulted in a complete loss of landing gear control, yet the pilot miraculously managed a wheels-down landing. Another aircraft, a resilient bird, lost its primary electrical system following a fierce fighter attack. Nevertheless, its essential instruments continued to function long enough to guide the navigator safely back to base. Coincidence? The crew chief would dismissively declare. Just a lucky coincidence. Zuck, however, harbored no belief in mere luck. He placed his faith in redundancy, in robust backup systems, and in the ingenious rerouting of critical functions through alternative pathways that were conspicuously absent from the original Boeing blueprints because the manufacturer had evidently never contemplated the grim reality of their beautifully efficient, yet inherently single-point-of-failure designs encountering the brutal impact of German 88mm flak. While his counterparts diligently replaced damaged parts with authorized new ones, Zuck was clandestinely redesigning entire systems on the fly, employing an eclectic assortment of scavenged components, jury-rigged borrowed tubing, and electrical connections that would have undoubtedly driven a meticulous inspector to despair. The other mechanics soon dubbed him the plumber, a moniker born from his constant habit of rerouting essential conduits, be they hydraulic lines, fuel feeds, or complex electrical bundles. He would routinely dedicate hours beyond his official duty time, toiling in the dimly lit hangars, a flashlight clamped between his teeth, meticulously rewiring aircraft in ways that were meticulously omitted from official maintenance logs. This clandestine work was necessary because, from a purely technical standpoint, his improvisations constituted flagrant violations of approximately 15 distinct Army regulations. When confronted with queries as to why he undertook such arduous and risky endeavors, especially when he could have comfortably remained in the motor pool, sipping coffee and avoiding any potential trouble, Zuck's response was characteristically straightforward and profound. Those guys fly the missions. The least I can do is make sure the plane doesn't kill them on the way home. The B-17 Flying Fortress was initially touted as virtually indestructible. Boeing's marketing literature practically guaranteed its invulnerability, and early combat reports from 1942 appeared to corroborate these claims. Fortresses frequently returned from perilous missions resembling airborne cheese graters, their wings and fuselages riddled with countless holes. Yet, with astonishing tenacity, they somehow remained aloft. Aircrews had, for good reason, affectionately bestowed upon them the enduring nickname, Flying Fortress. These formidable machines possessed an unparalleled capacity to absorb punishment that would have utterly atomized a B-24 bomber. However, by late 1943, a profoundly unsettling pattern began to emerge within the casualty statistics, a grim reality that no one seemed willing to openly discuss. Aircraft were not solely being lost to concentrated fighter assaults or direct flak hits to unequivocally critical areas. Increasingly, they were succumbing to single points of failure. A single, unfortunately placed hit in the wrong section of the airframe could cause a bomber, valued at $200,000 and manned by 10 highly trained airmen, to inexplicably spiral out of formation and vanish without a trace. The 8th Air Force was experiencing an alarming loss rate of approximately 5% per mission by autumn 1943. Simple arithmetic revealed the horrifying truth. A crew's probability of surviving their mandatory 25-mission tour was, disturbingly, little more than a coin flip. Something was causing B-17s to be destroyed by damage that, by all accounts, should not have been fatal. It ultimately required the practical insights of mechanics like Zuck, meticulously examining the wreckage, to definitively ascertain the root cause of the problem. The culprit, it turned out, was the hydraulic system. The B-17's intricate hydraulic network governed virtually every critical function essential for survival in combat: the landing gear, the brakes, the wing flaps, and, most crucially, the sophisticated turret systems that enabled gunners to effectively track and engage enemy fighters. Boeing had meticulously engineered an ostensibly efficient system, featuring primary lines neatly routed through the fuselage in tidy, centralized bundles. This design approach was perfectly rational for an aircraft conceived with peacetime efficiency in mind. Yet, this very efficiency, in the unforgiving context of aerial combat, regrettably translated into a dangerous concentration of vital systems. Consequently, a single piece of flak, striking within a mere 6-inch span of the fuselage, could instantaneously compromise hydraulic pressure to multiple, interconnected systems, effectively crippling the aircraft. A bomber could possess 3 fully operational engines, structurally intact wings, and a perfectly healthy crew. Yet, without the crucial functionality of its hydraulic system, the crew found themselves unable to deploy the landing gear. An B-17 forced to execute a belly landing on a hard English runway frequently resulted in a catastrophic fire, sealing the fate of both aircraft and crew. The perilous descent towards the runway frequently culminated in the B-17 Flying Fortress becoming tragically engulfed in flames, a fiery demise that underscored its inherent vulnerabilities. Beyond the immediate incineration risk, the aircraft's intricate fuel system possessed its own insidious mechanisms for jeopardizing human lives. This formidable bomber was equipped to carry a staggering 2,780 gallons of highly volatile, high-octane aviation fuel, meticulously distributed across 9 distinct tanks, 5 strategically positioned within the expansive wings and 4 secured within the fuselage. The sophisticated feed system was intelligently engineered to maintain aerodynamic equilibrium by drawing fuel progressively from the outer wing tanks inward. This represented a sensible engineering solution, yet a critical flaw emerged. The vital fuel lines interconnecting these tanks traversed sections of the airframe that lay directly within the lethal call to fire during aggressive beam attacks launched by German fighters from the precise 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock positions. Consequently, a single, accurately placed 20mm cannon round piercing a fuel line did not merely signify a catastrophic and immediate loss of fuel, though such an outcome was inevitably guaranteed. Instead, such a breach unleashed an uncontrolled spray of highly combustible aviation gasoline within the aircraft's interior, creating an explosive atmosphere where the confluence of superheated metal, potential electrical sparks, and the frigid, oxygen-rich air at -40 degrees Fahrenheit conspired to forge the ideal conditions for either a violent inferno or the debilitating phenomenon of vapor lock. It was at this juncture that a keen observer named Zuck discerned a critical oversight that had eluded official engineering assessments. He had noted a disturbing correlation. Aircraft that succumbed to inexplicable failures frequently exhibited discernible anomalies within their fuel systems prior to impact. Pilots would recount a terrifying sequence of events, commencing with the erratic sputtering of engines, progressing to complete engine failure, and culminating in the entire aircraft violently disintegrating midair or erupting into an inferno. Subsequent post-crash analysis, when sufficient wreckage remained for examination, consistently cited issues such as fuel contamination or the ingress of air into the fuel lines. The underlying mechanism, once recognized, was disturbingly straightforward. Shrapnel from anti-aircraft fire or machine gun rounds would compromise a fuel line, allowing air to infiltrate the pressurized system. This air introduction would then cause engines to progressively fail, one after another, as they were all reliant on the same interconnected and now compromised fuel delivery network. Consequently, the bomber would tragically plummet, not due to overwhelming structural damage rendering it unflyable, but rather because its vital systems were literally suffocating, starved of their essential lifeblood. The brilliant minds at Boeing had indeed conceived and constructed an aerial marvel, an aircraft that performed flawlessly and reliably under the control parameters of peacetime operations and optimal flight scenarios. However, the brutal realities of aerial combat raging over the hostile skies of Germany in 1943 were anything but ideal. This was an unforgiving operational theater, an environment that demanded an entirely different paradigm of engineering, one where every critical system within the aircraft had to be meticulously designed with the explicit assumption that it would sustain damage, yet still possess the inherent resilience and redundant capability to continue functioning effectively despite that compromise. Therefore, the true Achilles heel of the B-17 Flying Fortress was not its defensive armor plating or its formidable offensive firepower. Instead, it lay in a fundamental design philosophy predicated on single points of failure, where the incapacitation of one component could cascade into total system collapse. It was precisely this critical vulnerability that Zook, with his profound understanding of practical mechanics and an audacious spirit, began to systematically rectify, implementing a series of ingenious, albeit entirely unauthorized, modifications, one aircraft at a time. The actions undertaken by Zook, while not strictly illegal in the conventional sense, carried a far graver potential consequence. His endeavors constituted an egregious breach of protocol, the unauthorized field modification of critical combat aircraft systems. This meant that should any aircraft he had altered suffer a catastrophic failure, and subsequent investigations meticulously traced the root cause back to his illicit handiwork, he would undoubtedly face the severe repercussions of a court-martial, potentially even charges of negligent homicide. Yet, Zook's calculus was profoundly different from that of official bureaucracy. He reasoned that if he remained passive and adhered strictly to regulations, these invaluable aircraft, along with their courageous crews, were destined to crash regardless, victims of inherent design flaws. By daring to intervene, he believed he was at least affording them a fighting chance at survival. At the heart of his clandestine, yet profoundly effective, solution lay a brutally straightforward principle: to ingeniously engineer redundancy into systems where Boeing's original design had conspicuously omitted it. He would take, for instance, the aircraft's hydraulic system, initially conceived with a streamlined, highly efficient, single-bundle architecture, and transform it into a sprawling, intricate web of supplementary lines. This modified network, though appearing to the untrained eye as an unsightly plumber's nightmare, was meticulously designed to remain fully functional precisely at the critical moment when the primary system inevitably sustained damage. To achieve his objectives, Zook ingeniously began to salvage hydraulic tubing from the skeletal remains of damaged aircraft languishing in the salvage yard, components that, according to official directives, were designated for return to central depots for formal recycling processes. With meticulous care, he would excise sections of this tubing that remained miraculously intact, subsequently subjecting them to rigorous pressure integrity tests using a makeshift hand pump he had cleverly jury-rigged from various discarded parts. Once validated, these repurposed lines were then expertly integrated as crucial bypass routes into operational aircraft, breathing new life into potentially doomed systems. To illustrate the practical application of his innovative methodology, consider the standard B-17 configuration, which featured a singular, primary hydraulic line extending from the central pump directly to the landing gear actuators. Zook's intervention involved strategically tapping into this main conduit at two distinct junctures, one positioned forward, in close proximity to the cockpit, and another located aft, near the radio room. From these points, he would meticulously route a completely secondary line, deliberately charting a divergent course, often skillfully tucked along the robust fuselage stringers where it would benefit from the inherent protection afforded by the aircraft's structural members, thus minimizing its exposure to enemy fire. Subsequently, he would diligently install manual isolation valves at each newly created junction point, ingeniously fabricating these critical components from parts salvaged and cannibalized from other battle-damaged bombers. In the dire event that the primary hydraulic line sustained a hit and consequently suffered a catastrophic loss of pressure, the pilot was now empowered to physically reach down. Zook had thoughtfully positioned these valves within easy arm's reach and manually activate the switch to the robust backup line. This modification was undeniably lacking in aesthetic elegance. It undeniably introduced additional weight to the aircraft's payload. Furthermore, it constituted a direct and blatant violation of official regulations, specifically Technical Order ZO-120-EG2, Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection C. Yet, despite these drawbacks and regulatory infractions, this seemingly crude alteration represented the crucial, life-saving distinction between a controlled landing on functioning landing gear and a terrifying, uncontrolled belly slide down the runway, an outcome that typically concluded with fervent prayers for survival. His subsequent intervention addressing the inherent vulnerabilities of the fuel system proved to be even more audacious and, arguably, radical in its scope. Zook recognized the undeniable reality that completely preventing fuel lines from sustaining hits during the relentless gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire was an impossibility, an immutable fact of aerial combat. However, what he could achieve was to decisively interrupt the catastrophic chain reaction that typically ensued from such a hit, thereby preventing it from escalating into a total system-wide failure. His innovative solution involved the strategic installation of crossover valves between the various tank systems, ingeniously repurposing fuel petcocks originally designed exclusively for ground refueling operations. Officially, these particular valves were strictly designated for ground-based operations only, never to be manipulated during flight. Undeterred, Zook strategically installed them in positions readily accessible to the crew while airborne, and with a stroke of calculated ambiguity, documented their presence on official maintenance forms merely as refueling system check valves, a description technically accurate, yet deliberately lacking in specific detail regarding their true in-flight function. The profound impact of this modification was immediate. Should a fuel line sustain damage in combat, pilots were now empowered to swiftly isolate the compromised tank, effectively containing the leakage, and subsequently reroute the vital flow of fuel from the remaining intact tanks directly to the engines that critically required it, thus averting a potential power loss and ensuring the aircraft's continued operation. However, perhaps the most profoundly life-saving of Zook's ingenious modifications addressed the inherent fragility of the B-17's electrical system. The Flying Fortress relied heavily on a singular, primary electrical bus, a central artery that supplied power to virtually every critical component on board, encompassing everything from the essential flight instruments and navigation aids to the formidable defensive turret motors. A solitary, well-aimed hit to this vital bus would instantly plunge the aircraft into a state of utter darkness and functional paralysis. Instruments would cease to operate, radio communications would be severed, and the crucial gun turrets, the aircraft's primary means of defense, would become completely inoperable, leaving the bomber and its crew tragically exposed. In response to this grave vulnerability, Zook initiated the clandestine installation of secondary power lines, routing them directly from the auxiliary generator to the most critical systems, thereby completely bypassing the vulnerable main bus. With meticulous attention to detail, he ingeniously concealed these new lines within existing cable bundles, ensuring they mimicked the appearance of authentic factory wiring, a deception that held until one meticulously traced their actual, unconventional pathways. To further enhance their utility and ensure clear identification in an emergency, he deliberately employed a distinctive color of insulation, vibrant yellow, in stark contrast to the standard black, a visual cue intended to immediately inform pilots which circuit breakers specifically govern these vital emergency backup systems. The true genius underpinning Zook's entire methodology lay not in the invention of novel, cutting-edge technology. Rather, every component he utilized was already readily available, either integrated within the aircraft itself or easily accessible within the vast stores of the parts bins. His profound insight was to ingeniously reconfigure these existing puzzle pieces in configurations that Boeing's original engineers, focused primarily on manufacturing efficiency and streamlined production, had simply not contemplated. Their design priorities had been geared towards rapid assembly and cost-effectiveness, tragically overlooking the paramount need for robust combat survivability in the unforgiving crucible of aerial warfare. Indeed, a B-17 bomber emerging from the bustling Seattle production line in 1943 was a testament to wartime industrial prowess, designed for swift assembly by a workforce, many of whom had transitioned from civilian life, perhaps as housewives, mere months prior. In stark contrast, Zook's intricate modifications demanded the expertise of a highly skilled and exceptionally knowledgeable mechanic, one who possessed a deep theoretical understanding of complex aircraft systems and, crucially, harbored no hesitation in boldly departing from established blueprints when adherence to those very plans demonstrably jeopardized the lives of aircrews. By the dawn of January 1944, Zook had, with remarkable discretion and stealth, successfully implemented his unauthorized enhancements on a total of 17 B-17s within the operational inventory of the 351st Bomb Group. He meticulously avoided any form of self-promotion or official documentation of his groundbreaking work. Instead, his clandestine efforts were primarily carried out under the cover of night maintenance shifts, a strategic choice that minimized the presence of inquisitive officers who might otherwise pose uncomfortable questions regarding his unconventional activities. The tangible, undeniable consequence of Zook's covert interventions was startlingly evident. Those 17 modified bombers were now consistently returning from perilous combat missions at a survival rate that began to defy conventional statistical probabilities, appearing almost miraculously improbable. On the crisp morning of February 8, 1944, Captain Ronald Fletcher, the meticulous engineering officer assigned to the 351st Bomb Group, was already experiencing a decidedly unpleasant start to his day, a situation that was about to take a dramatic turn for the worse. He was engaged in the diligent execution of routine maintenance inspections, a standard procedure involving the random selection of aircraft from the flight line to rigorously verify their conformity with official technical documentation. It was during this very inspection, upon unlatching and opening the hydraulic access panel of a B-17 known by the evocative moniker, Devil's Daughter, that he was confronted with an intricate network of plumbing that, by all official accounts and blueprints, simply should not, and could not, exist. Captain Fletcher was, by no means a man to be underestimated in his technical acumen. Prior to the outbreak of the war, he had been an accomplished aeronautical engineering student at the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a background that endowed him with an unparalleled ability to decipher and comprehend complex engineering blueprints. What now lay before his eyes, however, bore no resemblance to any Boeing schematic he had ever encountered. A labyrinthine arrangement of secondary hydraulic lines snaking through unconventional routes, manual isolation valves meticulously installed in bespoke locations necessitating custom-fabricated bracketry, and intricate fuel crossover connections fashioned from components that appeared to have been salvaged from no fewer than 3 disparate aircraft. Crucially, the entire assembly exhibited an undeniable level of professional craftsmanship, dispelling any notion that this was merely a haphazard, impromptu-field expedient. Instead, it was unequivocally the product of deliberate, profound thought and systematic, unauthorized modification. Locating Zook within the cavernous expanse of Hangar 3, deeply engrossed in the arduous task of an engine swap, Fletcher immediately cut to the chase. "Sergeant," he began, his tone firm, "we urgently need to discuss the hydraulic system of Devil's Daughter." Zook, without so much as glancing up from the cowling bolt he was meticulously torquing into place, responded with a distinct lack of surprise, his voice betraying a hint of weary resignation. "And what precisely," he inquired, "is the nature of the concern regarding it?" With a gesture of exasperation, Fletcher produced his official inspection clipboard. "What about it?" he retorted, his voice rising with incredulity. "What about the undeniable reality that approximately 40 feet of completely unauthorized hydraulic line has been installed, routed through non-standard pathways, complete with manually operated valves that are conspicuously absent from any official technical orders?" Zook deliberately set aside his heavy wrench, slowly wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag that, remarkably, appeared even grubbier than his own calloused palms. He then met Fletcher's gaze with an expression that conveyed an equal measure of profound exhaustion and resolute defiance. "Do you, Captain," Zook challenged, his voice steady, "desire the officially sanctioned explanation, or would you prefer to hear the unvarnished truth?" Fletcher's rejoinder was instantaneous, devoid of hesitation. "Both," he declared unequivocally. "And we shall commence with an account of the duration of these activities, followed by an exact tally of how many aircraft have been similarly affected." 17 planes. That stark numerical revelation instantly set Captain Fletcher's blood pressure soaring. 17 operational aircraft, actively engaged in combat, had been subjected to extensive, undocumented modifications of their primary flight systems. The sheer scale of the regulatory infraction was utterly staggering, a monumental breach of protocol. The implications were severe. Zook faced the very real prospect of a court-martial, potentially leading to dire consequences. Moreover, Fletcher himself could confront disciplinary action for his perceived failure to detect these widespread alterations sooner, thus compromising his own career. Yet, amidst the rising tide of alarm and official concern, Fletcher then posed a singular, pivotal question, one that would irrevocably alter the entire tenor of their confrontation. "Have any of these 17 modified aircraft," he inquired, his voice now imbued with a newfound gravity, "subsequently experienced a hydraulic system failure?" In response, Zook calmly extracted a heavily grease-stained notebook from the pocket of his coveralls, a personal, unofficial maintenance log, meticulously kept but entirely separate from any formal military record. "3 of them," Zook stated matter-of-factly, consulting his ledger, "sustained direct flak hits to their primary hydraulic lines. Yet, every single one of those 3 aircraft successfully returned to base, operating solely on their newly installed backup systems. Devil's Daughter, in fact, made a perfectly controlled landing on her own wheels just 2 weeks prior, after an 80mm anti-aircraft round completely severed her primary hydraulic line during a mission over Frankfurt. The pilot, remarkably, remained entirely unaware he was relying on the backup system until I personally pointed out the extent of the damage to him during the post-flight inspection. Until the extent of the damage was meticulously detailed to him after the flight. Fletcher, with a keen analytical mind, mentally processed the astonishing figures. 3 instances of severe hydraulic system compromise. Yet, remarkably, not a single aircraft had been lost. Conventional aviation statistics suggested that a minimum of 2 of those formidable flying fortresses should have been irrecoverably damaged or completely destroyed. By the midday hour, Fletcher, recognizing the profound implications of these unprecedented survival rates, had formally brought the matter to the attention of Group Commander Albertson, the very same distinguished colonel who had personally witnessed the extraordinary, almost unbelievable landing of the bomber designated Lucky Strike, several months prior, in December. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 1,400 hours, Colonel Albertson himself was present within the vast expanse of the hangar, meticulously examining Sergeant Zook's ingenious modifications firsthand. Major Fletcher accompanied him, offering a detailed technical exposition and clarifying the intricate workings of the unauthorized alterations. Just 2 hours later, at 1,600 hours, a distinctly uneasy and tense gathering convened in the Group Operations Office, where the central, perplexing dilemma under intense discussion was whether to initiate court-martial proceedings against Zook for insubordination and violation of regulations, or, conversely, to bestow upon him a commendation or even a medal for his remarkable ingenuity and life-saving innovations. Major Henry Watkins, a distinguished officer from the 8th Air Force Engineering Staff, made his arrival on February 10th, tasked with initiating and conducting a comprehensive formal investigation into these controversial modifications. For 3 exhaustive days, he meticulously navigated the interior and exterior of Zook's specially altered aircraft, assiduously photographing every installation, scrutinizing countless maintenance logs, and conducting extensive interviews with the pilots who had flown these modified bombers. His initial, preliminary report, officially submitted on February 13th, contained a particularly pivotal paragraph. This concise yet profoundly impactful statement likely demanded an hour or more of his careful deliberation and drafting, primarily because it tacitly, yet undeniably, acknowledged that the Army Air Forces had, regrettably, been deploying their courageous flight crews into perilous combat zones aboard aircraft that possess preventable and critical vulnerabilities. While SSGT, Zook's modifications are unauthorized and violate standing technical orders, preliminary analysis suggests these changes address systemic vulnerability in hydraulic and fuel system design that may contribute to combat losses. Recommend against punitive action pending engineering evaluation and controlled testing. This singularly important paragraph, with its measured yet damning implications, not only definitively salvaged Staff Sergeant Zook's military career, sparing him from potential severe disciplinary action, it simultaneously unlatched a contentious door that none within the hallowed halls of the Pentagon desired to see opened. This particular door led directly to uncomfortable and potentially embarrassing inquiries concerning the tragic, unquantified number of flight crews who might have perished due to a fundamental design philosophy in Boeing's aircraft that, in hindsight, appeared to have prioritized rapid production efficiency and ease of manufacture above the critical imperatives of combat survivability for its airmen. Colonel Albertson, demonstrating pragmatic leadership, then rendered a decisive command decision, one that likely stretched the boundaries of several existing military regulations. His ruling stipulated that while Staff Sergeant Zook would unequivocally not face any formal charges or disciplinary proceedings, he was simultaneously prohibited from implementing further modifications on any additional aircraft until the comprehensive engineering evaluation had been thoroughly completed. Crucially, in the interim period, the already modified 17 bombers would continue to be deployed on combat missions, a testament to the undeniable efficacy of Zook's work, as even the highest-ranking officers within the command structure were compelled to acknowledge the compelling evidence presented by the survival statistics. Subsequently, on March 3, 1944, Major Watkins made his return to Bassingbourn, this time accompanied by a formidable contingent. This group included 2 civilian engineers dispatched directly from Boeing, a specialized team of highly skilled technical specialists from the Army Air Force, and a clear, urgent mandate from the highest echelons of command. This directive, in essence, conveyed an unambiguous message. Provide conclusive proof that these modifications are effective and safe, or, conversely, demonstrate definitively that they pose a danger. Crucially, this evaluation must be conducted with extreme urgency, for we are suffering grievous losses of our invaluable bombers in the skies over Germany. The period that ensued represented an unprecedented chapter in military aviation, unfolding as arguably the most informal, yet undeniably high-stakes, engineering validation ever undertaken. It involved the extraordinary process of rigorously testing unauthorized field modifications, crafted by an enlisted man, directly under the crucible of actual combat conditions. This unique situation presented a profound dichotomy. The evaluators were simultaneously tasked with determining whether to formally document these radical alterations as groundbreaking innovation worthy of widespread adoption, or, conversely, to compile them as irrefutable evidence for a potential court-martial, severely jeopardizing Sergeant Zook's future. Upon their initial inspection, the 2 Boeing engineers, both civilian specialists operating under military contract, reacted with palpable dismay and outright apprehension. The lead engineer among them, a distinguished individual named Carlson, who possessed an intimate knowledge of the B-17, having been instrumental in its original design and development back in Seattle, spent his inaugural hour at Bassingbourn articulating a litany of grave concerns. His pronouncements included alarming phrases such as significant contamination risk, unacceptable pressure regulation concerns, and the ominous prediction of potential catastrophic failure modes. His professional sensibilities were clearly affronted by the crude, yet effective, field modifications. Carlson, positioned before a partially disassembled bomber, gestured emphatically towards Zook's improvised bypass lines, meticulously elucidating to Major Watkins precisely why such an arrangement was, from a theoretical engineering standpoint, utterly unworkable. He asserted that these alterations blatantly disregarded the fundamental hydraulic system design principles, meticulously established and codified by highly qualified professionals holding advanced engineering degrees. Sergeant Zook, standing nearby in his characteristic grease-stained coveralls, patiently allowed the esteemed engineer to conclude his detailed technical critique. Then, with a quiet but pointed directness, Zook posed a simple question. "When was the last occasion you personally flew a combat mission?" Carlson, visibly affronted by the query, retorted sharply, "I am an engineer, sir, not a pilot." Zook simply nodded in understanding. "Right," he responded, his tone indicating a profound divergence in experience. "So, your expertise lies in designing this complex system in the controlled environment of Seattle, where the most severe consequence you encounter is a failed pressure test. My reality, however, involves maintaining these aircraft when they return, often riddled with battle damage and perforations. We operate from vastly different perspectives, you see. Major Watkins then unveiled a proposal that was, by any conventional standard, profoundly radical, to equip a selection of Zook's already modified aircraft with an array of supplementary diagnostic tools, including additional pressure gauges, precise flow meters, and advanced monitoring equipment. The next, audacious step was to deploy these instrumented bombers on actual combat missions, meticulously recording their system performance throughout the harrowing flights. In any rational and sane procurement process, such an experimental approach would invariably necessitate many months of exhaustive ground testing and simulations before even contemplating operational deployment. However, the grim reality of the situation was that this was March 1944. The brutal air war raging over Germany was reaching its devastating crescendo, and the valiant 8th Air Force was tragically sustaining an average loss of 6 precious bombers during each mission. Under such desperate circumstances, the luxury of months for preliminary testing simply did not exist. Over a critical 2-week span, specifically between March 5th and March 18th, a carefully selected contingent of 5 B-17 flying fortresses, each incorporating Sergeant Zook's ingenious modifications, collectively undertook a total of 11 perilous combat missions. These daring sorties targeted heavily defended enemy strongholds, including the formidable cities of Berlin, Brunswick, and Friedrichshafen. Each of these specially equipped aircraft bore an array of supplementary instrumentation, diligently recording vital metrics such as hydraulic pressure, precise fuel flow rates, and the overall performance of the electrical system for the entirety of each mission. Crucially, 3 of these 5 bombers sustained significant battle damage during their engagements. Yet, against all odds and conventional expectations, every single one of the 5 modified aircraft successfully returned to base. The accumulated data, stark and unequivocal, provided irrefutable evidence of the modification's efficacy. A particularly dramatic and illustrative incident occurred during the demanding mission to Friedrichshafen on March 18th. The bomber designated Memphis Belle II, a notable aircraft among those specifically enhanced with Sergeant Zook's modifications, sustained a direct hit from an 80mm flak burst. This devastating impact precisely shredded the primary hydraulic line at the very point where Boeing's original design routed it, conspicuously exposed along the length of the bomb bay. The onboard instrumentation meticulously captured the immediate, critical consequence. Primary system pressure plummeted catastrophically to 0 within a mere 4.2 seconds. Under standard operational procedures and established design parameters, such a failure should have rendered the aircraft completely incapacitated, unable to control essential functions like its landing gear, wing flaps, or braking systems. However, the courageous pilot of Memphis Belle II, diligently adhering to the specific briefing instructions personally imparted by Sergeant Zook, instinctively reached down and swiftly rotated 3 manual isolation valves. With remarkable efficacy, the ingenious backup system immediately engaged. Hydraulic pressure, though lower than optimal, swiftly stabilized at 85% of its normal operating level, a figure comfortably within the aircraft's operational range. Against all technical predictions, the bomber not only maintained its position within the formation, but also successfully completed its crucial bomb run. Ultimately, it made a safe, unassisted landing back at Bassingbourn on its own landing gear, while the assembled engineers on the ground, observing their monitoring equipment with a mixture of disbelief and awe, collectively realized they were witnessing a phenomenon that, according to all their established principles, simply should not have been possible. A complex hydraulic system that had definitively survived a catastrophic, mission-ending failure. Carlson, the seasoned Boeing engineer, observed the irrefutable data playback in a state of profound, stunned silence, his professional convictions visibly shaken. Eventually, he slowly turned to Major Watkins and uttered a statement that likely caused him considerable professional anguish to concede. By all established engineering principles, this system fundamentally should not function. The pressure dynamics are entirely incorrect, the flow rates are demonstrably inadequate, and there is a conspicuous absence of proper filtration within the bypass system. And yet, despite all these theoretical deficiencies, it unequivocally works. I confess I do not comprehend the underlying mechanism, but its operational effectiveness is undeniable. From the rear of the briefing room, Sergeant Zook, ever the pragmatist, offered an unvarnished explanation, one that, perhaps unsurprisingly, was probably omitted from any official technical report. It functions precisely because I engineered it to operate reliably, when every other aspect of the situation has already deteriorated into utter chaos. Your meticulously designed system performs admirably until the moment it catastrophically fails. My system, conversely, operates imperfectly all the time, but crucially, it consistently maintains its functionality. The comprehensive testing phase yielded an impressive volume of documentation, 47 meticulously compiled pages of technical data, alongside 11 detailed mission after-action reports. This formidable body of evidence culminated in an undeniable conclusion that the Air Force engineering establishment found impossible to disregard. The analysis unequivocally demonstrated that Sergeant Zook's innovative modifications substantially elevated the aircraft system's survivability without introducing any detrimental compromise to the primary system's essential functions. In simpler terms, he had ingeniously rendered the bombers significantly safer without in any way degrading their performance or operational capabilities. Consequently, on March 22, Major Watkins officially submitted his final report, which contained a pivotal recommendation destined to reverberate throughout every B-17 squadron stationed across England, formally authorized the immediate field modification of aircraft based on Zook's proven design, and concurrently initiate comprehensive training for mechanics across all 8th Air Force groups. As April 1944 dawned, while bureaucratic discussions within the Pentagon became entangled in debates over official procurement channels, and Boeing engaged in protracted negotiations for retrofit contracts that would, at the earliest, not materialize until June, a profoundly significant grassroots movement was independently unfolding on airfields scattered across the East Anglia landscape. Crucially, mechanics, the frontline engineers of the air war, were actively communicating amongst themselves. And when these skilled technicians engage in conversation, their discourse rarely revolves around abstract policy directives. Rather, it focuses intently and pragmatically on what demonstrably functions effectively in the harsh realities of combat. Staff Sergeant Mike Diacro, assigned to the 303rd Bomb Group stationed at Molesworth, became aware of Sergeant Zook's ingenious modifications through an informal but highly effective channel, a fellow crew chief who had recently transferred from Bassingbourn, bringing with him first-hand knowledge of the innovations. By April 8, Diacro seized an opportune moment during a routine supply run to Bassingbourn, arriving with his notebook prepared, and earnestly requested that Zook personally guide him through the intricate process of the hydraulic bypass installation. Zook, demonstrating remarkable generosity with his time and expertise, dedicated 3 exhaustive hours to meticulously illustrating every critical connection point, every precise valve placement, and every strategic routing decision involved in his system. Diacro, armed with this invaluable knowledge, immediately returned to Molesworth and, without hesitation, commenced modifying aircraft that very night. Within the astonishingly short span of a single week, The 303rd Bomb Group boasted 5 of its bombers operating with Zook's enhanced hydraulic system. News of this success quickly spread, reaching Technical Sergeant James Woodthorpe Abbots, who learned of it directly from Diacro. Consequently, by April 15th, the renowned 100th Bomb Group, infamously known as the Bloody 100th, due to its lamentable distinction of having the highest loss rate within the entire 8th Air Force, had its dedicated mechanics working grueling double shifts. Their urgent mission: to install these crucial bypass systems on every single operational aircraft under their charge. They did not passively await formal authorization. They did not engage in the bureaucratic process of filing modification requests. They simply took decisive action, driven by the harrowing experience of witnessing far too many bombers succumb to battle damage that, under more robust designs, should have been entirely survivable. This rapid, widespread adoption represented nothing less than a grassroots engineering revolution, proliferating organically and powerfully through informal networks, all while the ponderous official channels continued to deliberate on bureaucratic committee structures and procedural minutiae. At Kimbolton, Master Sergeant Robert Chen, demonstrating prescient initiative, began meticulously compiling statistical data that the broader Air Force command structure had not yet formally recognized or started to track. His unofficial records revealed compelling trends. In March, prior to the implementation of any of Zook's ingenious modifications, the 379th Bomb Group experienced a concerning 14% abort rate attributable to mechanical failures occurring during critical combat missions. By the close of April, however, with a dozen aircraft now operating with Zook's enhanced systems, that significant abort rate had dramatically plummeted to a mere 6%. Chen's personal log book, though entirely unofficial and lacking formal recognition from headquarters, documented an even more profoundly striking revelation. Bombers equipped with Zook's modifications that sustained battle damage were an astonishing 3 times more likely to successfully return to their home base compared to their unmodified counterparts enduring comparable levels of combat harm. The long-awaited official authorization finally materialized on April 28, 1944, formally issued as Technical Order 0120-EG-2127, precisely titled, Field Modification for Enhanced Hydraulic System Redundancy in B-17F and B-17G Aircraft. This document, comprising 6 dense pages of meticulously crafted bureaucratic language, essentially granted legal sanction for mechanics to proceed with actions that dozens of them had, in practice, already been undertaking for weeks. However, this official technical order was notably characterized by its cautious and inherently limited scope. While it explicitly authorized the hydraulic modifications, it conspicuously omitted any mention whatsoever of Sergeant Zook's equally vital fuel system crossovers or his ingenious electrical bypasses. This omission was largely due to Boeing's persistent insistence that these additional changes were both superfluous and potentially hazardous. Upon reviewing the newly issued technical order, Sergeant Zook let out a laugh, not one of genuine happiness or triumph, but rather the bitter, cynical chuckle of a man who had personally witnessed the ponderous machinery of bureaucracy nearly subject him to court-martial for his life-saving innovations, only to now observe that very same bureaucracy attempting to claim credit while implementing merely a partial solution. Undeterred by official directives, he promptly returned to his work, continuing to install the crucial fuel crossovers during the night shift, remaining as unauthorized as he had ever been. For Zook, the formal pronouncements emanating from headquarters did not alter the stark and undeniable reality that B-17s continued to be lost over enemy territory due to preventable fuel system failures. Going down from critical fuel system failures. By the advent of May 1944, This crucial modification had permeated an estimated 120 aircraft, disseminated across 7 distinct bomb groups. The officially sanctioned count of aircraft modified under the newly issued technical orders stood at a mere 41. This significant disparity between the official tally and the actual implementation underscored the ingenuity and moral imperative of countless mechanics who, upon scrutinizing the extant regulations and observing the operational realities of their aircraft, arrived at the same pragmatic conclusion as Zook. It was unequivocally preferable to seek clemency for an infraction than to solicit authorization when the lives of airmen hung precariously in the balance. The emergent survival statistics soon manifested in a manner that rendered them utterly undeniable by the Air Force Command. The 91st Bomb Group, Zook's assigned unit, where virtually every operational B-17 now boasted the complete array of modifications, encompassing the unsanctioned fuel and electrical enhancements, recorded an impressively low loss rate of 2.1% during May 1944. This contrasted sharply with the 8th Air Force's overarching average of 3.8%. While this numerical difference might appear modest at first glance, its ramifications were profound. When extrapolated across a month of intensive operations involving thousands of bomber sorties, it translated directly into scores of aircrews successfully returning to base, rather than being tragically designated as missing in action. Colonel Albertson, in a moment of either profound strategic brilliance or audacious career jeopardy, extended an invitation to an 8th Air Force statistical analysis team to visit Bassingbourn in the nascent days of June, tasking them with a comprehensive review of the group's compelling survival data. He meticulously presented every pertinent detail, the officially sanctioned modifications, the surreptitious, unofficial alterations, and the undeniable statistical evidence. The subsequent report from the analysis team, formally submitted on June 9, contained a pivotal sentence that unequivocally corroborated the empirical knowledge already possessed by every mechanic laboring on the flight line. Statistical correlation between modified aircraft and improved survivability is significant beyond normal variance and warrants expanded implementation. Thus, what began as a clandestine revolution of necessity had been formally enshrined as official policy. Zook, the intrepid innovator, had unwittingly become an archetypal figure, and throughout England, mechanics persisted in executing unauthorized modifications during off-duty hours, as official directives had yet to fully encompass the entirety of the comprehensive fix. They were, in essence, all Zook now, every sergeant wielding a wrench who, confronted with a rigid regulation, resolutely determined that ensuring the safe return of aircrews transcended the imperative of strict adherence to the manual. August of 1945 arrived, with the cessation of hostilities in Europe having occurred 3 months prior, when a discerning statistician at Air Force Headquarters, Captain Dorothy Henshaw, meticulously compiled a report. This document, though never destined for widespread publication, narrated an irrefutable story through numbers that defied any challenge. She had assiduously gathered mission data from every B-17 group operating within the 8th Air Force, systematically cross-referencing it with detailed maintenance logs that meticulously documented which aircraft had received Zook's modifications, encompassing both the officially acknowledged and the unofficial ones that mechanics had scrupulously recorded retroactively. Subsequently, she executed a correlation analysis that would undoubtedly have elicited immense pride from her statistics professors. Groups demonstrating a 75% or greater adoption rate of the complete modification package, encompassing hydraulic, fuel, and electrical systems, exhibited a remarkable 23.4% enhancement in aircraft return rates when compared against their pre-modification baseline. This significant figure represented 347 bombers that successfully made it back to base, rather than succumbing to the perils of combat over Germany or the treacherous North Sea. When one multiplies this by an average of 10 crew members per aircraft, and further factors in that some crews managed to survive even when their aircraft were lost, it becomes evident that Zook's forbidden fix had preserved the lives of somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 airmen who would otherwise have been tragically killed, captured, or listed as missing. However, the most profoundly impactful statistic was discreetly embedded within Henshaw's appendix data: aircraft equipped with the complete Zook modification package that sustained Category 3 damage, officially defined as damage necessitating major repair or comprehensive system replacement, returned to base an impressive 81% of the time. In stark contrast, unmodified aircraft experiencing identical levels of damage returned only 47% of the time. The modification, therefore, had not rendered the B-17s invulnerable, but it had decisively transformed what would otherwise have been merely survivable damage into actual, demonstrable survival. Paul Zook officially concluded his service with the Army Air Forces in November 1945, holding the rank of Technical Sergeant. He was awarded an Army Commendation Medal in recognition of his exceptional technical proficiency in aircraft maintenance. Conspicuously absent from his official record, however, was any mention whatsoever of the critical field modifications that had unequivocally defined his profound contribution to the war effort. Upon his return to Pittsburgh, he promptly reopened his established repair shop situated on Polish Hill, where he dedicated the ensuing 3 decades to the skilled repair of automobiles, trucks, and the occasional light aircraft owned by a local flying club. He rarely, if ever, spoke extensively about his wartime experiences. In 1973, a diligent researcher named Dr. Michael Torres, affiliated with the Air Force Historical Research Agency, successfully located Zook while conducting an exhaustive study on wartime field modifications. Torres spent 3 immersive days in Pittsburgh, during which he meticulously interviewed Zook and carefully reviewed the personal maintenance logs Zook had assiduously kept, a collection of grease-stained notebooks that had, by design, never been incorporated into official military records. Torres posed the poignant question that, in retrospect, arguably should have been asked 3 decades prior: why had Zook so deliberately risked a court-martial to implement unauthorized modifications? Zook's response, faithfully transcribed in Torres's interview notes, was characteristically succinct and direct. "Didn't seem that risky to me. Guys were dying because the planes weren't built right. I could fix that, or I could follow the manual. Seemed like an easy choice." The specific B-17 aircraft that Zook had first modified, christened Lucky Strike, the very bomber that catalyzed this transformative movement in December 1943, successfully endured the entirety of the war and was ultimately decommissioned and scrapped in 1954. Nevertheless, photographs meticulously documenting its hydraulic bay, captured during the comprehensive engineering evaluation conducted in 1944, found their way into Air Force maintenance training manuals that remained in active use into the 1960s. The accompanying captions, however, never explicitly acknowledged Zook by name, instead referring only to field-developed redundancy modifications. Consequently, generations of nascent aircraft mechanics unknowingly absorbed critical lessons from his groundbreaking work without ever discerning the identity of its original architect. Boeing, in due course, incorporated fundamental elements of Zook's modifications into the subsequent B-17G production run, commencing in late 1944. Yet, the official documentation disingenuously attributed these vital changes to ongoing engineering refinement, rather than forthrightly acknowledging that they were, In fact, adopting field fixes meticulously developed by a mere sergeant with a high school education, whose practical engineering acumen had been honed through the arduous task of maintaining Depression-era trucks. The post-war B-29 and B-50 bomber programs subsequently integrated redundant hydraulic and fuel systems as intrinsic baseline design features, crucial lessons painstakingly learned in the crucible of combat over Germany and judiciously applied by engineers who had thoroughly reviewed the comprehensive wartime modification data. Paulza passed away in 1989 at the age of 72. His obituary, published in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, made no specific mention of B-17s or his pivotal role in the war, noting only that he was a veteran and had successfully operated Zook's auto repair business for 4 decades. His invaluable personal maintenance logs, the unofficial yet profoundly authentic record of every aircraft he had modified, were thoughtfully donated to the Air Force Museum in Dayton following his death. They now reside within the museum's research archives, readily accessible to anyone who formally requests them. 47 notebooks replete with intricate technical sketches, precise pressure calculations scrawled in the margins, and insightful annotations rendered in a mechanic's unique shorthand that collectively narrate the true, untold story of how one man's resolute refusal to blindly adhere to the manual dramatically altered the survival odds for thousands of airmen who remained utterly unaware of his profound, life-saving contributions. The once forbidden trick ultimately evolved into standard operating procedure. The Maverick, initially an outlier, became a foundational template for innovation. The enduring lesson that individuals closest to a problem frequently perceive solutions that engineers in distant, insulated offices overlook remains profoundly relevant every time someone is compelled to choose between the rigid confines of a manual and the practical efficacy of what genuinely works when human lives are unequivocally at stake.